You are listening to Down Home. Food is the linchpin that connects us to our land, connects us to our culture. It also connects us to each other. Cesar Chavez said it best. If you want to make a friend, go to someone's house and eat with them. The people who give you their food give you their heart. In this episode, Jay and I talk about the unique aspects of Scotian food with Nigel Finley, who has worked many years as an executive chef, and Wendie Wilson, prominent Black educator, author, artist, and community activist.
Breaking new ground, breaking new ground, breaking new ground, simple breaking new ground, breaking new ground, breaking new ground, simple breaking new ground, breaking new ground, breaking new ground, simple breaking new ground, breaking new ground, breaking new ground.
Welcome to Down Home, the Nova Scotian experience by two Black men. I am Derek Wise, and as always, we have Jay Jones.
What's up?
And our conversation this week is with Nigel Finley. Nigel, how you doing?
I'm great, thanks. Welcome.
Okay.
Thanks for having me.
No problem. And our second guest is Wendie Wilson. What's up, cuz?
Hey, how you doing, fellas?
Good. So full disclosure, Wendie is my second cousin on my mother's side, so the Wilsons.
The Wilson family here in Nova Scotia.
Yes. All right. So Nigel, we're going to start off with you. So Nova Scotia actually has a very unique history when it comes to food. Now, from your perspective, tell us what separates us from the rest of Canada.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of influences that come into Nova Scotia cuisine, and I feel like a lot of those outside influences trickled into the rest of Canada as well. And I had a little bit of trouble kind of separating out in my head, what is purely Nova Scotian, especially when you grow up in it and you're immersed in it.
Yeah.
Is to think about a certain dish as, this is super Nova Scotian is not something you do. You just think about it's just food. It's just what you're eating. But I think a lot of what for me makes something feel Nova Scotian or taste Nova Scotian is a lot of the people aspect that comes into it. It's our food seems to be so kind of convivial and social and focused on the gathering of people together, and there's a certain sort of hard to pinpoint it, but a certain sort of like love that you can taste in it. Obviously,
so it's almost like a cultural.
I think
thing.
so.
Yeah.
I mean, there's dishes that I would say are quintessential Nova Scotian dishes that when I introduce them in other cities in the country, people peg them as quintessential East Coast and are typically super impressed. But when you're doing like clam bakes and fresh biscuits and lobster boils and stuff like that, blueberry crunch, pickled herring, smoked herring, kippers, all that stuff, that's just something that has a certain sort of love to it, I guess, certain sort of just richness.
Right.
It's true.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, like even just thinking about this podcast in itself, I just thought about kitchen parties and food and community, and someone would bring a case of keese and different things like that, and just the thinking about this, just it reminds you just of growing up, how rich the food history was and how much it brought us together. So I can agree with that.
Like to Jay's point, like from growing up, it was always centered around the church and gathering and like Sunday dinners, that sort of thing. And like talking about our, the African Canadian, or African Nova Scotian, I should say, portion of it. Wendie, you're actually quite versed in history and culture of our community, which dates back, 400 years. Can you just give us a little bit about that African Nova Scotian history with food?
Yeah, certainly. So my people have been in this province, our people, both sets of parents, or my parents and both sets of grandparents, and as well as 8 generations with the nephews and great nephews and nieces. And so I kind of went on a quest maybe about around 2016, 2017, when my daughter came home from school. She was attending the Francophone school here in Nova Scotia, or one of them. And she did a project on some of the founding cultures, some of the historic cultures here in Nova Scotia, the Gaelics and the Mi'kmaq and the Acadians, and also African Nova Scotians. And so, I was very curious about what she listed as our traditional foods, what she listed as our traditional clothing, and what was our language, all those like components of culture that other people are so steeped in and just come so automatic. Like when we think about Jamaican culture or Irish culture, we already know these things. These things are common knowledge. Mm-hmm. The food, the flag, the clothing, all of those pieces are those ones that you quite often would see at a place like a multicultural festival. But what I noticed is with my culture, the African Nova Scotian culture, those things weren't as solidly documented. And so I went on a quest to start doing some informal research and just asking folks, some elders in North Preston and folks from down the line, like, what kind of meals are you eating? Like, what are you eating? Like, because I'm pretty sure, based on our connection with the AUBA, the African United Baptist Association, that even though we were spread, from Yarmouth right straight through to Cape Breton, over 52 historic Black communities, that we were eating the same things. Mm-hmm. And so I felt like that had to be legitimized, because quite often when we talk about African Nova Scotian food, people will say, well, that's just maritime food. That's just food that we eat in Cape Breton. People eat that in Newfoundland. And what I discovered is that some of it is. Some of it is the traditional maritime dishes, like your boiled dinner. But of course, we had the salted pigtails in there. Other folks around the province weren't doing it with the salted pigtails, and the chow chow and all those other pieces. And then I also, when I talked about baked beans and saltfish, the fish cakes, and folks would say, well, yeah, well, we have the same recipe, and what I realized is that our saltfish, our fish cakes are generally fish cakes that anyone would eat in the Maritimes. Like you would see that all, like the salt cod, the mashed potato, the white onion, and the summer savory. That's how my mother always made it. That's how I make it. And that is a Nova Scotian thing. But I think it was one of those things that when we came to this province felt familiar, right? Like every Black culture has some kind of fish cake. So when we came here and we saw folks were doing these fish cakes, I think we most likely thought, wow, okay, that's familiar to me. So we adopted salt cod. Baked beans. What I tend to do with my baked beans is put some kind of salted pork in there, like a ham hock or bacon, or the salt fat pork scraps that you would fry up and throw in there to flavor the meal. Yeah. And what I discovered was that would have been a meal that our ancestors would have been eating during the times of enslavement. They would have been given rations of beans and corn, and hence the cornbread, right? Beans, corn, and then they would find scraps of meat or be given scraps of meat, things that were discarded to add flavor to the meal. And so when I think about the meal like that, even though baked beans and saltfish fish cakes are something that most people are accustomed to in the Maritimes, I feel a special connection to that meal. And I know that other African Nova Scotians do as well. So it just a little bit more about where our food comes from and our like really eclectic list of recipes. And I say recipes loosely because we don't necessarily write things down.
Yeah.
You know, if you're looking for a list of African Nova Scotian recipes, probably the only spot you're going to find them as a collection is church cookbooks.
Mm.
Right? Someone's willing to give up their secrets. Otherwise, you know, the biscuits and the cornbread, every family has their variations on it. And we also had to make sure that we were working with what we had. So you might have, you know, lard this time, but next time you have shortening or you have butter, but you made it work. And so you made those adjustments and you learned by watching, right? You learned how to make these meals through osmosis, you know, being in the kitchen with your aunties and in your grandparents and, you know, your mother. And so every time I go to make any of these meals, not only am I, you know, throwing a bunch of ingredients in the pot, but I'm also throwing in the most important ingredient, which is memory.
Yeah.
Right? Memory. And food is directly linked to culture.
That's very interesting. That brings back memories of sitting in the kitchen with my grandmother, and she's no cookbook around, no books at all, and she's just like throwing stuff in there and like making her apple pie. Oh my gosh, man! But she's like just throwing stuff around, making stuff, and like the preparation is like that, and the end product came out. It was amazing. I remember that. That's a very good memory.
Yeah, for sure. Now, how do you think, like, so back in the days of enslavement, you know, obviously we know the story of like sometimes they didn't have proper land to garden and stuff, but they adapted very well. And how, like, is that how they sort of added their own flavor, like being able to grow some spices? Because sometimes Nova Scotia is sort of the Scottish way that we sort of consider the way we grew up. Some of those, you know, main staple recipes, sometimes they weren't really flavorful. At least they weren't in my house, because anyway, my great grandmother wasn't the greatest cook, but, you know, very loving, but not the greatest cook. But sometimes the food was bland. So how did they sort of bring their stuff, like, you know, that they learned from before they were slaves, or, you know, how did they bring that into the repertoire?
Okay, so one of the things that we did right from the beginning before enslavement is that when folks were being stolen from Africa, one of the things that they did, one of the most important things, and one of the most important things to them in their culture, was to be able to bring their food. So there wasn't, okay, you got an hour, grab what you need. Like, obviously we knew there wasn't any of that. People were stolen out of the villages and from the interior of Africa. And what they decided to do, at great risk, I would imagine, is to sow seeds into their hair.
Really?
Oh, wow.
So we sowed in rice and okra seeds and yam seeds, and we brought our food with us.
Wow.
We brought those things with us. That's how important food was to us. Food is, in my opinion, food is everything. It really is. It has a link to everything. Our mental health, our spiritual health. Food is sacred. Our physical health. All of those pieces. Our gut health is directly linked to our brain health and our mental health. And so we knew how important food is. As a matter of fact, there's a man by the name of Anan Leiloli. He's one of the leaders in the Black food sovereignty movement in Toronto. And he said something the other day, I was chatting with him, and he said something that really struck me, and so importantly, mentioned that food is our premier medicine.
Yeah.
Food
wow.
Yeah, that's think about that. That's actually quite powerful, actually.
It's
that goes both ways, because our Western society is sick because of some of the stuff that we're putting in. You know what I mean?
A lot of the stuff. You know that 50% of what young people eat is ultra processed food.
Yeah.
Right? This is not some of it. A lot of it is making us sick. People who are severely food insecure die 9 years prior to people who are not.
Wow.
Wow.
They have higher rates of diabetes and respiratory illnesses, and even links to suicide.
Mm.
And this is a Canadian study that was done, I think, around 2017 and at the University of Toronto. So these are Canadian statistics.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, it's very different than the way that we grew up, obviously, because everything, I remember everything being homemade.
Yeah.
Like me and Jay are expats, but we do have a really great appreciation for some of the foods that we did grow up with. Like I mentioned, my grandmother in the kitchen, like those are just awesome memories. And it was centered around her cooking and the meals that she made. Now, Nigel, what are some of the dishes, some of your cooking memories that you remember growing up with in Nova Scotia?
Oh, there's so many. And just to kind of reflect on some of what Wendie was saying, that I remember, like I think all of you being in that kitchen, just like watching my mom do stuff, watch my grandmother do stuff, and that was the central part of the house, and that was where you wanted to be, and that was where everything was happening. And I think that our collective generation are better off from being exposed to that. My sisters aren't chefs, but they both learned how to cook just by osmosis, by being around. And a lot of that kind of an older generation knows how to provide for themselves and potentially is better off than a younger generation that doesn't have as much exposure. I think which I think is a huge issue, which causes them to go the route of processed foods and so on and so forth, just not being exposed. So I think that foundation is super crucial to our health. And my mom cooked every meal at home. We had a garden. We ate out of the garden, not exclusively, obviously, because gardening in Nova Scotia is not farming in Nova Scotia is not a year-round affair.
Yeah.
But there was always like an oat cake or a butter tart or a scone. Like Nova Scotia tea biscuits I still make on a regular basis, and people are blown away. Cornbread, which I until recently didn't think too much about kind of where it came from. I kind of thought of it as a fairly Nova Scotian thing and a fairly southern US thing, and then thinking more about where that came from is pretty interesting. Beef stew with the biscuit dumpling floating around in it. Haddock chowder, like chowders all the time. Grilled mackerel. This is stuff that nobody eats anymore, I would say. But, fishing mackerel out of the harbor, which in hindsight might not be the most healthiest thing, but
we did it though.
We
ate it.
We rolled the dice on the fact that they were pretty migratory fish, and hopefully they're spending most of their life somewhere else. But that's one of my fondest memories is growing up. In August, rowing out in a little rowboat and jigging mackerel out of the harbor or out of the Northwest Arm and eating that for breakfast. Pepper relish. Like my mom we had a whole pantry of preserves, which is again something that I think is disappearing slowly. We picked blackberries off of this bush for days and days and days in the summer. I think we ate a jar of blackberry jam every day till we picked them again the next year. Pickles in the cupboard, rhubarb jam in the cupboard, pepper relish on everything. I think it's just, man, I could go on and on and on.
It's interesting how how similar growing up in different cultures, but how similar Nova Scotian food is. Like some of the stuff that you're mentioning, my grandmother had a rhubarb patch in the back. She preserved rhubarbs, and the Nova Scotian tea biscuits are very different than scones, though.
Yeah.
There is a difference, right? And like and I didn't discover that difference until I was older. Like someone gave me, I said, okay, yeah, I can have that tea biscuit. And then she kind of looked at me, what's a tea biscuit? You want the scone? Yeah, okay. And I'm tasting, I'm like, what is this? What is this?
It's like styrofoam or something. That's what I always felt the scone was. But Nigel, just a quick question. Would you say your mom inspired you to cook, or what was your inspiration to get it into becoming a head chef? Or
I think it, being surrounded by in that environment triggered my passion for cooking.
Yeah.
My dad didn't cook when I was young. He's since taken a great interest in it and cooks all the time now.
Yeah.
But at the time he didn't, and I distinctly remember my mom saying, as a gift to your future wife, you're going to learn how to do two things. You're going to learn how to cook, and you're going to learn how to do laundry. And from 10 years old, I was doing both, and I was pretty confident that that's where I wanted to go.
Cool.
And would always muck around in the kitchen, and even in high school, like my friends and I we'd have dinner parties, like we'd buy a bunch of food and buy good wine and do stuff that I don't think other 16-year-olds were doing. Which prompted me to, explore the restaurant industry. And, my first meaningful job, I would say, was a dishwasher in a nice restaurant, which happened to be in the Ontario area. I went for the summer to Muskoka, hang out at a buddy's cottage and work as a dishwasher. And I was fortunate to get into a place where the chef was a huge kind of influence on my career, and kind of if my second experience or my third experience had been my first experience, I'm not sure I would be doing this right now, but I got into the right spot with the right people. And from a few weeks in, even as a dishwasher, I was like, I want to be that guy.
Wow.
And cool. And that was, I think times are a little bit different now, but that was in the era where chefs were just becoming kind of rock stars, and it was pretty hardcore and badass to be in a kitchen. And so that partnered with the fact that I already loved cooking, kind of solidified my path, I would say. And then just grinding ever since, from being a dishwasher. I've done more 100-hour weeks in my life than I want to count.
Wow.
But it's, people say it's not work if you love it. And I would say that, about half of that was I didn't love and would consider work, but the other half has kept me going and just moving on and moving up in my career, and just trying to take the job of the guy above me pretty much the whole time.
Right.
And doing it with a passion for food, and also trying to share that passion as much as possible. It's a favorite part of the favorite part of my job is teaching and mentoring and sharing that. I love nothing more than to see somebody young come in and learn something new, or add something to their repertoire, or under my tutelage grow and be successful in their own right. And that comes from just, I think, being that initial beginning of being nurtured in the kitchen and in the food environment is something that's translated, that I now pass on as much as possible.
That's important. It's important to do. What about you, Wendie? What are some of the foods you grew up on and loved?
Some of the foods I grew up on and loved are, Jay, you asked me a question earlier about just like seasoning food, and we would have had access, in prior years to different seasonings. And what I wanted to mention is that the way we get our food hasn't always been through like traditional farming methods. And I think we learned a lot from the indigenous folks, probably both here in Nova Scotia and when we were down south. And so in, traditional indigenous cultures, a lot of food is foraged, right? So you find out, you become familiar with the land. And when I think about the health piece, I think about like how we nourish our bodies physically, but also how we nourish our souls and how we get out into nature and connect with nature. And that's what, the collection of food kind of does for a culture, is it connects you and makes you familiar with the land. And so a really big thing, Derek, as you remember from up in Guysborough, we're foraging for blueberries and berries. And my cousin Angela, my Aunt Norma's daughter, we were chatting a couple years ago, and she had mentioned how for some families this wasn't necessarily a choice. Like, I know when I went up home to Guysborough, I had a choice to pick blueberries, but not everyone has a choice. It would be a job for the younger folks in the family to go out, fill the bucket up, don't come back unless the bucket is full. All right. Lamb's ear and different greens and different herbs that you could find growing naturally in the environment, so that when you think about a farm, it doesn't have to be, row upon row of the same type of things. It could be going out into your local forest and finding things that, you could use to flavor your foods, or to add, or to supplement, what you might get from the grocery store. Or it could be the substantial part of your meals, what you would find, near a river. So one of the fondest memories for me is a connection with food and my father, and how he always made the night lunches. So my mother made the majority of meals, with the exception of like Christmas. My dad would like take care of the turkey, and he did night lunches. And so I remember his night lunches consisting quite often of fried eels. So fried eels, fried mackerel, Gasparot. I remember going to get smelts with him. I don't know where we were, but we jump in his station wagon or his van, whatever he had at the time, and some man on a bridge and with a garbage bag, and he dipped his net into the water, and Gasparot would jump in, and that's how we got a lot of our fish. Like, very rarely do we ever get fish at the grocery store. Although I do remember, well, we actually never got it at the grocery store. We got it at Fisherman's Market. There used to be a Fisherman's Market down on the waterfront.
Yeah.
My father knew all the guys. He loved like some nicer like varieties of fish, like halibut was his favorite, but it was quite expensive, and that's something that you couldn't catch yourself. And so, but my dad, I remember another fond memory was helping him to skin rabbits that he would prep later on. He would go out home, set the traps, snares. He taught my brother Jason how to set snares. I never learned how to do it. I wish I would have, but most likely because I was a girl, and that's not something that girls would traditionally do. But I would help him prepare the meat. So we used to go to school, Jay. I don't know if you remember this from back in the day, having people come to school with the rabbit feet. The rabbit.
Yeah.
Rabbit paws.
Yeah.
The real. So that's what I would help. And that would be the reward, is I'd help my dad skin the rabbits. And then as a reward, I would get to take the rabbit meat to school. Like, and it was a pretty popular item back in the 70s. Like, supposed to bring you good luck. But the rabbits and the Gasparot and the smelts and the eels and the deer meat, all of those things would have been something that we would have borrowed or learned from the Mi'kmaq people in it. These are the same food they eat as well.
Yeah.
Right? So we got the maritime influence, the boiled dinners. We have the Mi'kmaq traditions of gathering and foraging foods that are out on the land. We also have the methodology, so the way we cook fryer foods, like from our African ancestors who would have cooked over an open flame, would have fried lots of foods. Also, our Caribbean ancestors who would have blended their spices and some of their stewing methods, because for the most part, African Nova Scotian food is slow food.
I see. Yeah.
Right? It's slow food. It's food that takes all day. Food that you have to prep the night before. You have to salt. You just can't make salt cod fish cakes. You have to soak that the night before and drain the water and be attentive and be home and pay attention.
Yeah.
And So a lot of our food is slow food, but as you can see, it comes from a lot of different sources as well, from the spices to how we cook our food to where we get our food from, how we forage, and the way that I grew up for the most part, and I know the way we grew up. Food didn't come with instructions. You know, there was my mother. I never saw my mother looking on the box trying to figure out, well, 350. You know, it was all like raw ingredients.
Yeah.
Right, that she used.
Yeah. They took a recipe. Sorry, D. They took a recipe and just sort of elevated it by experimenting. You know, it's really cool.
Yeah, just Wendie, both you and Nigel were talking about your experiences around fish and stuff like that, and memory, and basically how we didn't get our fish from a supermarket. It was other sources, right? I remember, growing up on Creighton Street, and this dude used to come by a house or come down the street, and he would put his head out the window and go, "Fresh mackerel."
Yeah.
100%. The mackerel. He was all over Mulgrave Park, Block A, Block B, Block Square. He was in Square Town. He came in and he would yell the mackerel, and the mackerel man that we had, he always reserved the fish that were pregnant that had the roe for my mom. Like he always knew that like we love roe, so he's like saved a couple of fish that have the roe, and that is something that as the youngest, I was home a lot with my mom, and so that's something that like we kind of shared secretly. Like she'd be prepping, cleaning the fish for dinner, but we would fry the roe up right away, and her and I eat that.
Yeah.
That and the turkey neck. I was always around for the turkey neck when it came out a couple hours before the turkey was ready.
Yeah.
I'd be waiting patiently in the kitchen for the turkey neck.
Yeah. Oh, even out in Klein Heights, we had a mackerel man too, coming down the street on Margaret Road, fresh mackerel. And then my grandfather would be like, "Jay boy, go get him." So I'd go out and say, "Hey, we need this." But I remember that too. And that's an interesting segue. Speaking about fish, is because Nigel, one of your big specialties was seafood. From what I can remember, you sort of brought that, whatever you learned in Nova Scotia, you brought that with you. You were a head chef, executive chef at Chase, wasn't it? I believe, and a few other restaurants in Toronto. And you sort of kept that vibe with you all along. Is that still something you do today, or can you sort of give me a rundown?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say I walked into any situation being like, "Oh, I'm a seafood chef." I've always been a chef. But being from Nova Scotia, I guess I kind of got pegged as a seafood focused guy, and it was also something that I was good at, and what we were doing in Toronto was different than a lot of other places in Toronto at that time.
Yeah.
Like clam bake has been one of my signature dishes, for lack of a better term. I don't really kind of hate that term because it pinpoints you into only being able to do a couple things.
Right.
But every time we do a clam boil with potatoes and corn and maybe a lobster or some mussels in there, like people lose their minds.
Yeah.
So it's just something I've always been good at. I did open the Chase in Toronto back in 2014, I think it was.
Yeah.
And I worked at a restaurant prior to that in the St. Clair neighborhood called Catch, which was
right. I remember that one.
Very seafood focused. And I was buying a lot of my fish from Nova Scotia. Actually, I had a couple of connections back in Nova Scotia, and what I was getting was bycatch boxes. So, they'd go out to fish their however many tons of halibut, and everything that they brought on board that they couldn't sell due to regulations, they'd be pegged as bycatch. And so instead of letting that go to waste, I'd get these random boxes. And so I'd get hake and pollock, and I get an albacore tuna in there every once in a while, and flounders and other stuff like that. And just kind of make a menu of it that day and wait to see what the next box was to kind of
Yeah.
put that together. So I went through a run in Toronto, and I left Toronto 2018, I think it was. Um, and I would say that all my experiences there were very seafood focused. So
Yeah.
it is something I love. I would never put a label on my hat that says like the seafood guy, but
Right.
it is something that, you know, has been a major part of my career.
Yeah.
And now I'm in Vancouver. I'm working at a private golf club, actually, which is a bit of a change from the restaurant world, but super fun, and I got a lot of free reign,
Hmm.
and I'm the food and beverage director there, so I run the front of house as well, but still in the kitchen cooking every day, and
Hmm.
still mentoring and teaching and bringing in as much of the East Coast influence as I can.
That's cool.
It's pretty interesting here on the West Coast, and how, you know, Canada's pretty massive geographically, but we do a lot of things different here on the West Coast than they do on the East Coast. So
Yeah.
it's fun introducing that culture over here for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. You can't. Once we're a maritimer, you can't take that away from us, right?
No,
And we're
not at
always
all.
bringing that maritime vibe with us to
Right.
everything. Our personality, our food. It's important, and to the community. So, yeah, I remember tasting some of your food quite a bit, and it was always fantastic. So, yeah, man, that's cool. Wendie, I understand you have a few educational initiatives that you're working on right now that involve educating Black communities about food and nutrition. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So some of the things that I've been doing over the last couple of years really kind of started around this food sovereignty thing, or Black food sovereignty movement. Kind of started for me during COVID. 2020, I was asked to talk about Black food sovereignty, and I did a little bit of research on the movement, and it's something that's been happening in other parts of Canada and in other in parts of the U.S. A lot of food movement in New York, lots of stuff going on in Toronto. Quebec is really interested right now in the Black food sovereignty movement. So just this past week, there were some sessions held in person and virtually for folks that are kind of already in the movement, but just politicizing themselves and trying to access funding. So over the last couple of years, I was asked just to talk about the connection between food and education, because
Mhm.
I primarily I am an educator. I was part of the public school system for the last 20 years, and most recently I now work as a executive staff officer, BIPOC engagement and advocacy with the Nova Scotia Teachers Union. I am the second Black person in that role in 125 years.
Wow.
In As a staff officer, but the first in this type of role where we're looking at Black and Indigenous and people of color, the whole BIPOC thing. And so I've been doing lots of presentations with colleagues, with other teachers throughout Canada. So yesterday or Thursday, I did a presentation for the Canadian Teachers Federation in Ottawa around Black food sovereignty, and the difference between, really my main objective was to share the difference between a term that we hear quite often, food security. We hear that term being thrown around all the time. People are food insecure. We want people to be food secure. What does that actually mean? And for me, it's more important for people to be food sovereign. So even when you're food secure, it means that you might have a grocery store up the street. You might have access to food. You might even be able to afford the food that's at your grocery store. There might be other amenities. You might have all the utilities that you need in order to prepare a meal and a safe place to do that. But does that mean you have control over your food?
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean? Do you even know where your food's coming from?
Yeah.
What is in your food? So the food sovereignty piece is about really connecting to nature, connecting to culture. They say that people that eat their indigenous food are actually healthier. than people who don't. So being food sovereign means that like I'm in control of my food systems, not just able to access food that might even be unhealthy for me, that might actually not be good for the environment, right? That doesn't connect me to my culture. And so this Black food sovereignty movement is really a cultural movement, and it's about self-determination and control, us controlling our health, because our food is our health, right? Our food, what we eat, determines how healthy we are. And how healthy we are also determines like our quality of education and our access to all these other pieces. So when I say food is everything, for me, food is everything. And so I also get to share some of that information with some youth here in Nova Scotia, myself, as well as 7 other Black educators have started the African Nova Scotian Freedom School. So that's an avenue to share this information. Community groups have been looking for it as well. And I sat on a Indigenous and Black Food Sovereignty Advisory Circle, which now has moved on to becoming a governance board, right? So we're looking at creating policy around food security and food sovereignty. Because I feel like in terms of being able to actually do something that makes a difference, I think that the first place, I mean, there's many places we could start, but one of the first places is policy, like creating policy, you know, making people accountable for what they say they're going to do, having some kind of referent that we can say, well, listen, well, this is what it says in the, you know, 94, what I'm thinking about, the Truth and Reconciliation, right? Indigenous people are able to go back to that document. Hey, we need to go back. This is what you said you were going to do. The Black Report, you know, recommend 48, 46 recommendations. We can go back to that. And so, so one of the things that I've been busy doing is collaborating with Indigenous and Black food sovereignty people from around the country. So, you know, all of the provinces and the territories, and just really, I'm doing a lot of presentations, a lot of teaching, but mostly learning. Like I'm mostly in these spaces learning from incredible people. And in particular, like I want to just really just talk about one group, the Indigenous folks in this country, in this part of the world, and other parts of the province, different provinces, have taught me so much about food sovereignty. And there's a man by the name of Byron Beardy. He's part of the 4 Arrow Nations in Manitoba. So there's 4 nations. His family belongs to one of those nations. And he said something that was honestly groundbreaking for me. So simple, but so true. He said that when you're born, food is included.
Wow. Yeah.
Food's included. We've made food into a commodity, right? You at one point, we at one point, our ancestors at one point were able to find and collect and feed themselves from the land, right? Hunting, foraging, fishing, cultivating, you know, farming, like all of those pieces where every person should have a right to healthy, culturally appropriate, in a dignified way, should have a right to food. Like shouldn't have to beg for it. Shouldn't have to go to the food bank. Shouldn't have to do all of these, you know, ask for a free lunch at school. All these things, these are our basic human rights to be able to have access to healthy food.
Yeah, that's it's important work, definitely. And I'm glad that you're tackling it. It's that's awesome. And just a quick side note, I want to get both of you guys' take on like we're all dealing with the effects of inflation recently. And I'm just wondering, first, Nigel, I'll ask you, in your industry, how is it affecting your work? Because everything, like from supply chains to this inflation, food is impacted in this manner, right? How is it affecting your work?
It's crazy. The prices, as you know, are through the roof. everyone goes to the grocery store. I think I was paying $4 for a loaf of bread last year and $8 or $9 now.
Wow.
In a grocery store in Vancouver, for a loaf of bread, and that's out of control. From a restaurant perspective, our costs go up and our budget stays the same, and the end user is not really prepared to pay. I would say, in general, not really prepared to pay the resulting price. Okay, bread's more expensive in the grocery store, and they accept that. But when a burger goes from $15 to $30, no one's paying that, or no one wants to. And so there's definitely a disconnect there. I think that our one of our major issues is the food waste at the beginning of the line that drives the prices up, and our as a society, how we want our food to look when we buy it, and how much waste that creates in the fields and in the sorting and all the middlemen that ends up before it gets to us. I think should change, which would help impact those prices. A red pepper costs $6, but we're also throwing away the pepper that's got a blemish on it. So there's some major systematic issues there. What I hear from doing investigations with my suppliers and looking at the people, the purchasers of the big companies, is that it's not going to get better. Is essentially what I'm being told, and that food prices are going to go up 10 to 20% every year.
Really?
As a forecast, and maybe it'll level off at some point, but there's a lot of problems we got to fix in the system, or people just won't be able to. I mean, people will continue to eat less healthy, and they'll continue to not have enough food. So it's a problem.
And Wendie, from a community advocacy standpoint, these rising costs, what angle are you taking on that? Like, how does that affect you and what you're doing?
I think that's where the food sovereignty piece comes in, because someone else is in control of our food. Someone in control of the prices, what we have access to, how we get our food. Like, someone else has access to that, and that is in and of itself the problem. So we need the local. One of the tenets of Black food sovereignty is the local piece. So we need to localize food. So if we're able to equip communities with places to grow food, we, myself and 3 other African Nova Scotians this summer, along with Just Food, which is a Halifax City initiative, decided that we're going to create a Black food sovereignty plan for Nova Scotia. So actually for Halifax, but we're hoping that people would use this as a model for other parts of Nova Scotia. Toronto, just during their first year of actualizing their Black food sovereignty plan that they started in 2021. So they're in the first phase. And if we're able to there's all these little odd pieces of land throughout the city, like on the end of a boulevard or in front of just odd pieces of land that aren't really big enough to grow or to build a structure, but big enough for a greenhouse or big enough for some planters. And so there are a lot of new Canadians that are here as well that really take advantage of that farming piece, like the community gardens. And that's kind of how I got started with growing my own garden. Is I accessed one of the community gardens that is on Bayers Road underneath this overpass and next to the fire station, this piece of land that no one was using, that didn't have access to water. And so we remedied that by getting a water tank and using the water from the fire station next door. But there's lots of pieces of land like that around the city. So if we're able, as Black people of African descent, are able to access these pieces of land from the city and grow our own food, people are bringing in seeds and growing food that they would have typically grown in Africa. And there's food that you can grow here, cultural food that people can grow that is familiar to them. Because when they come to Canada and they see the Canadian Food Guide, which coincidentally looks very much like the most recent Canadian Food Guide, like very like plant heavy, you know, and protein from like animals, is definitely a lot less than what we were accustomed to eating. Because growing up, we were eating meat with every meal.
Meat and potatoes, yep.
We ate meat with every single meal. And so but a lot of our ancestors would not have done that. Right. We would have eaten mostly plant-based food and flavored our food with meat, salted meat, smoked meat, you know? And so we were eating what the current food guide kind of suggests now, coincidentally. But also, when you look at the Canadian Food Guide, when you look at that visual, if you're coming from another country, you might not even recognize some of those foods. Right? So I think that really giving people access to be able to grow their own food and preserve their own food and really put the control at a local level, then when Loblaws and Sobeys decide to raise the prices and, you know, they're deciding what vendors they're using and what foods are going to be coming into the store. But when we put control over our food systems at the hands of the people in community, then I don't really see this as an issue. I don't really see the cost of food as an issue and the raising inflation prices. Really what we need to do is we need to make sure that we have seeds, we have fertile land to plant our seeds, and we are able to create systems within community collectively to trade some of those things, to make sure that our neighbors are well fed, and to make sure that we now have control over our food and our food, more importantly, our food systems.
Yeah, that's kind of brought us full circle, because we started off talking about how back in the day, you know, a lot of our food came off the land, right? And you know, there's something to be said about that, definitely.
Yeah,
because you know, like Aunt Edie and your Uncle Charlie, and when Grandpapa out at the homestead in Guysborough Road, I don't ever have any recollection of, like, even as a young kid going out to Guysborough Road, of him ever visiting a grocery store.
No.
Yeah, interesting.
They didn't go to grocery stores.
Yeah.
You raised a couple pigs, you had chickens, you could get your greens, your dandelion greens. You see what they're doing with dandelions these days?
Yeah.
A helo, right? The milk from the dandelion, the dried leaves, like the roots of the dandelion plant, like going back to those medicinal pieces, like our great grandmother, or your great grandmother, Derek, Sophia West.
Yes.
In the backwoods, she had all kinds of medicines. I remember my father having like the mason jars, the big mason jars, and I wish I would have asked more questions, but he would go out home and come back in. I don't know what he collected, but he would have it steeping, probably bitter tea, in a glass jar, and that's what he would drink, right? So even the medicines, we didn't go to the pharmacies for the medicines. Our medicines came from the land. And in order to keep us healthy, our medicines, as my friend Anand Lailoli mentioned, food was a premier medicine. That's right. That's when you know, come wintertime, my mother always had in that little honeybee shaped or honeycomb, honeybee shaped bottle, honey. She would mix up honey and lemon. And before we went to school every morning during the winter months, you had to take a couple of shots of that before you went to school, 2 teaspoons. And then you were healthy through the winter.
Yeah, that's back in the day. My goodness, man.
Yeah, man.
So this has been a fantastic conversation. You know, reminiscing about how things used to be when it's centered around food and how things are going. Thank you both very much for your time. Nigel, is there anything else you want to add before we wrap up?
Not particularly. I want to thank you for having me on, and pleasure to finally put a face to the name, and love hearing your stories, Wendie. And it's this interview and the process leading up to this has been so interesting to really open our minds as to where the source of Nova Scotia food came from and how intertwined it is. It's really special.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And Wendie, do you have anything to add? Because
I think probably the last thing that I would say is that, we really need to be thinking more about our connection to food. And when thinking about our connection to food, really thinking about our connection to land, because land is directly connected to culture. And connecting to land means that, we become healthier, and that we know where our food comes from. And we really need to stop to consider the health benefits and also the disadvantages that come with what we're consuming, right? What we're consuming, like, just think about your digestive system, and most issues that people have are really around digestion. And when people are food insecure, they are twice as likely to have respiratory issues when they go to the hospital. They're 4 times more likely to have mental health issues. And just if we can think about food as being our premier medicine, then we can really think about every time we take a bite of something or we're preparing something, what the health benefits or the disadvantages might be. And so one of the things that I always thought that was so important to combat, to fight, was racism, until I realized that really food is the first fight. I really need to be fighting for access to healthy food, and access to healthy food, really putting that at a local level and putting it in the hands of the people that are actually going to be consuming that food. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I guess the last thing I just want to mention is that the connection to land. I heard this quote, they who control the land control the people, or control the food, and they who control the food control the people. Whoever is controlling the food, they're controlling us. Mm-hmm. Right? We're like, how do we deal with this inflation? How do I now get, access to apples? How do I get access to medicines and things that they're in control? We're in the corner. We're back in the corner. But I think that could be very not easily remedied, but I think there is a solution. And I really and truly believe that food sovereignty is the piece that's missing.
Right. No, that I can definitely see that. Definitely.
Well said. Yeah.
Jay Jones, take us out.
Yeah. Well, I mean, doing these podcasts is always a treat, because you get to see familiar faces and catch up and learn new things. And, Nigel, of course, our history, and it's so cool that you're from Nova Scotia. And it was also cool that you could come share your time. And I appreciate that, man. And Wendie, same with you. Memories, nostalgia going back to the church days and the hot lunch program and everything that Nova Scotia embodies. There was always food to eat. It might not always been when I was young, it was like you said, a lot of meat, potatoes, and fried bologna sandwiches, but it was all good, and there was always food to eat, and it really brought a sense of community. And it's so good to be able to be a Maritimer and continue that sense of community even through these conversations. So I want to thank you both for sharing your time, and keep on keeping on and fighting the good fight, really. And that's about it. So thanks for coming on with us.
Thank you.
Nice meeting you, Nigel. Good seeing you again, Derek and Jay.
Yes, indeed.
Thanks for the invite.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Breaking new ground, breaking new ground, breaking new ground, breaking new ground.
You have been listening to Down Home. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
Breaking new ground, 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 yeah. On a high plateau. plateau. From the one down below to the future of the funk, getting lost in the flow. Contact with the spark magex. Now it's time to flex with the force from the soul, reaching all aspects, getting deep, no time to sleep. As you reach your next phase, laying it all on the line. New trails start to blaze. It's a fire inside, a brand new path, breaking down the sum to one. Feeling free, I just laugh.
The song Breaking New Ground from The Breakdown.
Like magic prescribed, only to see the perfect blend, like a diamond in the rough, ready to drop a perfect gem. It's time to shine so fine.